We are following the left-wing story of the political cultural struggle, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And Antifa seemed to be one of the most important factors of this fight. Andy Ngo is an American journalist, author, and social media personality, best known for his coverage of radical left-wing militant organizations such as Antifa. Mr. Ngo is the editor-at-large of the Post-Millennial, a regular guest on Fox News, and he has published columns in outlets such as The Spectator, The Wall Street Journal, The National Review. Mr. Ngo, welcome to Rakrakon. Thanks for your breathtaking book, for your visit in Poland. You were in Poland last weekend. Could you walk us through the reasons for which the Antifa right now is a global entity, is a global, I would say, problem for free societies? You were witnessing it with your own hands, with your own eyes, and with your own health. You were in hospital, beaten up by the Antifa thugs, just for the reporting of the things that the people should see all over the world.
Well, in Western Europe, they've been organizing for decades, particularly in Germany, where they are originally from, but also in Sweden, France, and also England. It was only after Donald Trump was elected that they really became a political force in the United States. And they were coddled by the American press and the chattering classes, who viewed them as a part of a legitimate response to the so-called resistance to the election of Donald Trump. So these people, back in 2016 in November, when it was announced that Trump had won, in my city of Portland, Oregon, in the west coast of America, they rioted for 3 days. And when I was just a student journalist, I witnessed mobs of them wearing black uniforms, covering their faces and carrying bats, breaking cars, smashing their ways into businesses, starting fires in the streets. In the way the reaction from the political left-wing establishment was essentially, this was okay because we're angry about Donald Trump. And that was continued for all the way up through 2020, when after George Floyd died, then what we saw were essentially attempted uprisings across the United States. Antifa and their allies in Black Lives Matter and other left-wing and far-left extremists from city to city were involved in political violence, arsons, lootings, robberies in Seattle, Washington, in the northwest of America. That was probably the most extreme example in that they actually took over city property, 6 blocks, created their own blockades, created what they said was an autonomous zone, essentially their own city-state. They had checkpoints, they had people with guns, and this was allowed to go on for more than 3 weeks, and people were murdered in the so-called autonomous zone.
Well, what is the death toll of this whole process? Did you ever try to count the amount of victims of so-called Antifa? Actually, well, let's start with this question, because this may give some perspective to the viewers that are not familiar with the scale of the issue.
So we have had several Antifa-identified killers in America. The most close to home for me was in Portland, Oregon last year, when we had night after night of riots in August of 2020. There was a self-identified Antifa security person who shot dead a Trump supporter in downtown Portland and then escaped. He was killed by law enforcement 5 days later. But he left behind a manifesto essentially espousing the Antifa ideology that people need to take up arms against the state, that this is a fight against fascism, and we have to do anything we need to do. And in his mind, and in the minds of the Antifa, that includes killing their political opponents. So they've celebrated him. In 2019, the year before that, there was a firebombing attack by an Antifa member in Washington state. He attacked the Immigrations and Customs enforcement facility. So he came with a rifle and homemade firebombs, and according to law enforcement, was trying to ignite the 500-gallon propane tank that was attached to this immigration facility. He was killed before he was able to kill anyone. And there's been other people as well. Unfortunately, or unsurprisingly, I should say, the American press normally doesn't really provide much reporting when it comes to far left extremists because
and the why you've been talking about the reasons for which those kind of news are not reported. Also, in one of your public statements, you claim that the number of deaths related, maybe not the victims of Antifa by itself, but that's related to the wave of riots and manifestations all over United States that were taking place for months in 2018, 2019, and 2020, goes much higher.
Yeah, so if you tuned into the mainstream broadcast television last year, like CNN, for example, they were describing the riots as mostly peaceful. That's a quote, while standing in front of neighborhoods that were torched and on fire. Right?
Famous footing with the CNN reporter having, there's nothing to watch here, everything is calm, and behind him we've seen the flames and cities that were burned down by the rioters.
To answer your question, there's been more than 24 deaths related to the riots.
2,000 people.
Over 2,000. No, over 24 26 known deaths related to the riots. And these are high numbers, but everyone brushes over it. We're still told even today, even though we've had 26 people who were killed because of the riots, that these were peaceful demonstrations for racial justice.
Well, that's absolutely incredible. I was in the United States in June 2019. I've seen the people trying to topple the statues in front of White House. I've seen the attempts to create a Washington version of Shahs in front of the White House. The parts of the streets are called right now the Black Lives Matter Boulevard. Those were the things that were pretty hard to understand for the Western civilization country journalist who was reporting important political events. I mean, it looked like the law and order didn't apply in the very heartland of the United States in front of the White House. It's very hard to imagine that, but that was what was happening. You've seen the same areas in your hometown city in the United States. We've seen the same in Seattle. What was the nature of those issues, of those things?
So in Portland, there were 8 statues that were either toppled or removed by the city. Other American cities saw statues toppled over and over. We're dealing with an uprising, if you will, of far-left extremists who feel actually empowered to go out and take matters into their own hands, to destroy art, to try to erase history, to attack civilians, to start fires, to initiate political violence. And they've been encouraged for more than a year by the mainstream American left. And this is what's most disturbing and troubling to me, because the quickest way to disintegrate a society is to break down this norm that political violence is not acceptable. But we're seeing, last year, if you look at the commentary that was in the broadcast television, the opinions that were in our papers of records, the mainstream left was very approving of those actions because they viewed it as in opposition to the president at the time.
Mr. No, when I'm asking questions to the Polish left-wing politicians and asking them questions about the nature of Antifa, I hear very often the thing that you are writing about. There is no such thing as Antifa. This is only an idea. Antifa does not exist. Why? We all know it exists. I mean, we all see the results. Well, you were beaten up. You were held in a hospital for activity because of the activity of the people of Antifa. Yet the official political line is Antifa does not exist. What does it mean?
So they say that because they are in denial about the existence of far-left extremism. I think this has been really the big success of the far left in America, is that they've been able to cover their tracks and cast this amnesia in the minds of the public. I mean, going back to the 60s and 70s, America actually had domestic terrorist communist groups who were involved in killings, in robberies. And some of these people many of them were convicted. Some of them fled to Cuba. That history and of course, the long history of the Cold War is entirely forgotten by today's generation because of our poor education system. And so I would say that if you don't believe Antifa exists, that is a conspiracy theory, because you don't have to actually just look at their online groups, the Antifa social media accounts. You can look at their literature. You can go to their events. You can reach out to me. I'll tell you where to go, what time, and you can go and see Antifa with your own eyes in America. Also, you can look in some of the court documents where evidence has come out to show that these people either espouse some type of belief in the Antifa ideology or were part of the organizing type of system.
Antifa was named by former President Donald Trump the organized terrorist group. It looks like an international organization. We are having footage. We can also show the footage of the Antifa in Germany. What are the origins of this organization? It's very interesting that Antifa, with the name that they are using, is referring to the beginning of the 20th century in Germany. Could you emphasize on that and develop the reasons why Antifa is called this way exactly?
The original Antifa was a paramilitary of the German Communist Party in the early 1930s. So before the Second World War, if you go back to the time of the Weimar Republic, when there were all these attempted uprisings from the far left and the far right.
So let me just interfere for a second. For those who are familiar with the history of Europe, it means that those were the groups who were trying to execute the communist revolution in Germany, the one that didn't succeed, the one that didn't manage to come out in the early 20th century. It was exactly what they were doing. Those were the people who were controlled by the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The original Antifa paramilitary was extremely Stalinist in their political ideology. In the German Communist Party, was very close to this with Stalinist in orientation. So, I'm speaking to a Polish audience, and so the Poles, the Central and Eastern Europeans, understand what actually life under communism is, and the so-called anti-fascist ideology was institutionalized at the state level in East Germany after the Second World War. The Berlin Wall, as we know in the West, was called the anti-fascist defense barrier to the East Germans.
Well, that was the way that Joseph Stalin called all the political parties in Western Europe, including the Social Democrats. Those were fascists generally as well for Joseph Stalin. It looks like the Stalinist pattern is being repeated by the Antifa today.
Yes, exactly. And I'm really glad you bring that up, because Americans don't really have a good understanding of World War II history. We didn't experience it on our soil. We don't remember. We don't know what real communism is. We don't even know what real fascism is. So we have this caricature playing out in the public space where a fascist it can be anybody who's a conservative, a patriot, a Donald Trump supporter, a Republican, whatever. And they're branding this anti-fascism as fighting for social justice, fighting for equality and for rights. And it's a way to fool people. And the Antifa movement in Poland is quite nascent right now. I saw some of the graffiti in the old town in Warsaw when I was there. But I guess my concern is that if people just sort of sit back and turn a blind eye, as Americans did 5 years ago, nobody really thought that this group of people carrying bats and crowbars and breaking stuff could actually really raise entire neighborhoods and parts of cities entirely to the ground.
And my final question is the question of the political, or well, I should call it political technology, online technology of creating an Antifa within the American and European societies. I mean, it looks like a modern version or fashionable version of famous movies. The Fight Club movie looks to me like the original the pop culture idea behind it. Everyone can be Antifa, but this is a structured movement. This is a structured pattern. I would say, in a way, it looks like a franchise. Anyone can set up a franchise of Antifa. You just have to go online and set up your own unit. But in general, it looks like a powerful movement in the Western Europe. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think describing it as a franchise is probably the best way I've seen it described by any host that I've spoken to. I think that where the confusion happens is where people think of it as one organization, centralized with a leadership structure. It's not like that. By design, it's built in a way that you cannot topple it over because there are all these franchise locations, if you will, or cells.
Well, this is the way you are building a spy cells. This is the way that you are building a cells behind the enemy lines by the military or paramilitary organizations. This is exactly the way it looks like.
Exactly, and they've caused so much violence and destruction in America. And I don't know what it will take for Americans to wake up. Hopefully, with my message in journalism being introduced to a European audience, maybe people here can avoid some of the mistakes that Americans are continuing to make.
Well, we've seen the so-called guests of Antifa on the Polish independence march years ago. Hopefully nothing like this will happen, at least in Central Europe, with our own memory of what communism and communist terror means. Anino was our guest. He was also our guest in Poland for last week, and hopefully we're going to have you in Poland again with your breathtaking reporting. Thank you very much, and thanks for your courage in describing those issues.